Well, thank you for everyone joining us today. We'll go ahead and get the show on the road. It's been 5 minutes. If you're that late, you can watch the recording. So thank you all for joining us. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about certified payroll and how to really get paid for the work that you do from the government. And so today, you're going to hear a little bit from myself. My name is Dwayne. I'm with ClockShark Time Tracking, and then we have Nick Foucault over from Points North, who specializes in certified payroll. And so a little bit about myself. I went to college for construction management. I've been in construction my entire life. I grew up around a family business. I was a project manager at a restoration company, seeing projects go from flooded house to mitigate to dry to rebuild and moving people back in. So the whole process. And then Nick, you know yourself better than I do. So why don't you kind of give us a little high-level overview of yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I've been with Points North for a decade now, and our company is focused on compliance-based software. And I've actually been involved with several different software systems as we've developed them to help people in the payroll space deal with different compliance requirements. And the specific product that I'm the director of is our certified payroll reporting system, which we're obviously going to talk about here. But yeah, a lot of experience in the compliance space and leveraging payroll data to help with those compliance tasks.
And that's perfect, since that's the topic we're on today. So to kind of jump right into it, right, a little bit of housekeeping. If you have to jump off early, or like I mentioned, if you came in late, or if you weren't able to attend, or if you want to show this to anybody, we'll send you the recording. So shortly after you guys are on here, you'll get a little link to where the recording is going to be, so you can go back through and pick up anything that you may have missed or that we went over too quickly. And then at the bottom of your screen, there's going to be a little question and answer box. You can go in there and pop in questions whenever you'd like, and we'll get to them throughout the presentation. Either I will answer them when Nick is talking, or vice versa. And then throughout the presentation, we're just going to ask for a little bit of participation from you from poll questions. So every few slides, we're going to ask you a few questions. So go ahead and be a doll and participate in those. So today's agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about what certified payroll is. If you've never heard of it before, or if you've kind of heard of it, we'll talk about what it really is. Why companies typically don't involve themselves in government jobs, common mistakes to avoid, necessary data that you need to capture and how accurate it needs to be, the actual payroll process behind that, some common headaches, and just some tips and tricks for you guys while you're starting to approach these types of jobs. Because when you do it right, and Nick will talk about it, there's some pretty good fruit on those trees. So the first poll question, jumping right out of the gate, what do you think is the hardest part of certified payroll? You can select all that apply. There is collecting accurate data, keeping track of work classification, applying the right wage determinations, submitting the report, or understanding different forms or requirements for different states. Again, what do you think is the hardest part of certified payroll? Nick, what do you hear more often in this case?
Well, I might influence some of the answers here, but my opinion is definitely centered on the report formats, right? I mean, there's at least 60 off the top of my head that I pretty much have memorized at this point in my life. So having to deal with those different formats, not easy.
I don't even think I have 60 phone numbers memorized. That's impressive. I don't know what we did before contacts and cell phones.
Good question. I think about that a lot.
The things you forget that you remembered.
Exactly.
All right, we'll give everyone about 5-10 more seconds to go and answer the questions. Again, what do you think is the hardest part of certified payroll? There's A, collecting accurate data, B, keeping track of work classification, C, applying the right wage determinations, or D, submitting the report, and E, understanding different forms and requirements for the different states. All right. Awesome. Thank you for the level of participation in there. Yeah, oddly enough, Nick, your biggest concern wasn't there. It's applying the right wage determinations, and a close second, collecting accurate data. For those of you that are on paper timesheets and try to do this, I'm sorry. So jumping right into it, what is certified payroll? And Nick, go ahead and hand it off to you on this one.
Sure. So the way I always like to explain this is kind of in three parts, right? There's terminology that gets thrown around in the space a lot, and people are oftentimes using certain terms to refer really ultimately to kind of the same thing. And so there's a federal law from the 1930s called the Davis-Bacon Act. So that Davis-Bacon term gets used a lot in this space. That's the law that created the requirement to pay what are called prevailing wages on government funded jobs. So basically you take on a government funded job, the government is going to tell you what you have to pay your employees, right? Back to that poll question, applying those different rates. That's exactly what that premise is really all about. And from there, not only do you have to do that properly from a payroll perspective, but you also have to do very, very specific reporting on a pay period basis, on a project basis, about what happened on that particular job, that pay period, right? So did you pay the employees the rates that you were mandated to pay them because of the fact that it was a government funded job? That's really ultimately what this is all about. And quick logistical question, Dwayne. Oh, there we go. I was wondering if that was me advancing.
I just need to click the button.
All right. You can click it one more time if you want to, and we'll round out the 3 items here. So the Davis-Bacon Act created all of this in concept, right? And then prevailing wages, that now is at a state level and a municipal level even. So you take on government-funded jobs at any level, and you'll have those prevailing wages to comply with. And then, of course, the reporting is what's really designed to show the compliance with the rates that you had to pay when you're working on those jobs.
So why do you think companies stay away from government jobs?
So there's definitely some specific themes here that I've seen, which is just a lack of knowledge or information in general about what all this is, right? Even what we were just talking about, what is Davis-Bacon? What is prevailing wage? I'm just going to stay doing my private jobs and I'm not going to worry about this, right? That's a lot of what we'll see. But when somebody does decide that they're going to get into this space, there's still things that people are apprehensive about, right? One of those is fear of just making some form of mistake. And I do like that poll question, that answer, that concern about applying the right rate, right? That's a huge concern for people, because if you don't have those rates properly understood, you could potentially pay somebody, either too much money, which is not as bad of an issue as paying them too less money, or too little money, I should say, because that really is ultimately what this compliance aspect calls for, is making sure those people are paid properly because they're entitled to that rate by virtue of the fact that it's a government job. So fear of making mistakes around that, fear of making mistakes with the reporting, which leads us right to the next bullet point, just purely the administrative side of this and the paperwork side. That is something that people really, really don't want to deal with. You take on these jobs, you take them on in certain areas across the country, and all of a sudden you've got a very specific certified report format that you've got to complete every single pay period. And that format might change on the whims of, a government agency. Mm-hmm. So people are prone to shy away from that, just from the administrative paperwork burden side of it.
Well, yeah. One thing you and I were talking about just the other day is, I forget the county, I think it was like New Jersey, that all of a sudden just decided to go all online. Mm-hmm. And didn't tell anybody. And people are trying to submit paper reports and they're just getting denied and no one knows why. So it's understanding that side too. And an interesting comment came in from Mindy, is that a lot of times with prevailing wage webinars like this, or just approaching it, there's no instructions. There's no, hey, put this here and submit this over here and do this afterwards. And so I don't know how much detail we'll get into that today, but what we'll do is we'll give you guys a lot of resources, and of course, Points North with Nick here, that's what they specialize in. And so there's a ton of resources that they have readily available to get you guys off to the right start.
Yeah, I see Mindy's comment here. I'll just comment on it briefly. Sure. Even some of the language you're using there, Mindy, I'm assuming just by what I see there, you're probably doing your work in California, right? Because you're referring to this apprentice piece and some of this training fund stuff. So yeah, I understand exactly what you're describing. And that really is the challenging part, which is, how do you do the steps that are necessary to get not only the payroll done properly, and even before that, you have the timekeeping piece, and then at the end, you have the reporting, and how do you make that all work? So yeah, to Dwayne's point, we'll get into some of that, but I definitely understand why you're asking or making the comment that you're making.
Yeah, there's everyone gets into business because they want to make a difference. They want to make money. They want to build cool stuff. But then there's roadblocks like this that really put up a lot of friction that keep you from growing. And that's tough. And so there's options out there to really help people through those situations, and you don't have to go it alone. I think that's one of the things that should have been up here, is the fear of having to do everything yourself and not understanding that the resources are available. All right. So poll question number 2, how do you collect data for your certified payroll right now? Is it manually or electronically? It's a lot easier of a question than the last one. Last one was a little bit of a mouthful. So again, how do you collect data for your certified payroll, manually or electronically? I feel like this is kind of a loaded question because there's like 4 things that you can track data in. Right? Are you collecting the time on paper and then putting it into a spreadsheet and then manually putting it in? Or for those of you having to do this whole thing manually, apologize. We'll give everyone a little bit longer. Again, how do you collect data for your certified payroll? Is it manually or electronically? All right. Perfect. Most of you chose electronically. That's great. And like I mentioned, there's multiple ways to do things electronically. And there's multiple steps, and we'll go into some of those as well. But the electronic people out there, that's good. That's an easy way to stay compliant and reduce human error. So when you're collecting time or submitting those reports, right, here's some common mistakes to avoid to kind of help you guys get into that flow and understand what you're going to come across with. So Nick, right, so some of the common mistakes, like not understanding the data necessary to provide accurate and proper reports. Like what are some of the things that people miss when they first get into this?
Exactly. And I even saw a question come in that I can kind of address that feeds into that answer. There was a question about how often do prevailing wage rates change, right? So even something like that. And the answer is it's dependent on which agency you're working with, right? So some agencies will issue new rates every 6 months. Some will do it every 12 months. Some will do it quarterly, right? Typically, it's not more often than that. But even just understanding the data that's necessary to provide the accurate, proper reports is a big issue, right? Because what is this report really calling for? Which rate is current? Which one should I be showing on here? If you don't have a sense of that data, and we'll definitely talk more about the data elements as we go, but not having a sense of that data, a very common thing that can lead to mistakes with the reporting aspect.
Yeah. And then the other mistake is paying the correct prevailing wage, something you just mentioned, right?
Exactly.
Lots of issues, lots of mistakes come in. But is there an easy way to cross-reference which wages are the correct wage? Is there like a database?
Absolutely. The way that really works best is by housing those rates at a project level, and then what we would call a work classification level, right? And then even at an employee level. So you might have employee John Smith, who's going to work on project ABC as a carpenter, and there are certain rates that apply when that is the case, versus employee John Smith working on project XYZ as a plumber, and there are certain rates that apply when that's the case. And so storing and managing those rates with those effective date ranges, that really helps to mitigate the risk around not understanding which rate is correct. And then also making sure that the right rate gets paid, because you can send that data into payroll if you're tracking it properly that way.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Having all that stored and ready to go. And right there, right, not having the data properly tracked. I know some of you had mentioned you do it electronically and manually, or both at the same time or individually. But like what Nick just mentioned, like having all that stuff stored, like even in an Excel spreadsheet, is tough because you still have to reference it. Right? You still have to find a way to go and pull that information rather than just loading it into something and it does do it automatically. But I'd be interested to see, one of the, I think we should add a follow-up poll question for this, is not having, or when people say manually and electronically tracked, I'd be interested to see like which information people are tracking manually versus electronically and what people mean by that. Because I feel like people are still relying on a spreadsheet to store this information. So example of some of the data breakout that you were just talking about, storing the information, kind of want to walk through this a little bit if everyone can see it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple of questions that came in that will relate to this page, right? Because this is actually a page in our certified payroll reporting solution, right? And it's representing the data at the point in time when the payroll has actually been processed for this pay period. And there was a question that came in about, well, if a rate changes in the middle of a project, do you stick with the rate you were paying, or should you comply with the new rate? And the answer is, if it's changed in the middle of a project, the new rate as it takes effect with those effective date ranges is necessary to start adhering to. And that's kind of the idea behind our system, which is that you can store and manage this data in a way that lets you have the right rate related to the hours that are worked on a daily basis, and then on a project basis, and then on a work class basis. So it all kind of comes back around on itself after you process payroll. This is the breakout of the data that's necessary to accurately produce a certified report. And quick note on another question that came in. Somebody mentioned a Rhode Island report calls for non-certified hours to also be shown. Yeah, absolutely. There are reports that do that too. So really the concept of just understanding the hours worked by day, by project, by work class, even if it's not prevailing wage, having a time system to solve for that, that's critical to make sure you have the data at the end of the workflow to properly generate the reports.
100% agree, right? So it's just organizing the data on the front end before having to file and run those reports, right? And there's multiple ways to do that. And so necessary timesheet data for the accuracy side, right? So understanding time data for certified reports, the hours by day, by job, and by work classification. Tracking that manually is a giant pain, right? So having a digital system in place to capture that stuff out in the field will mitigate like 80% of the headache that you have in order to submit the information to even submit the reports, right? So that screen that we just showed you, like where does that information come from? And I think most of you, that's where the manual side comes from our experience on the ClockShark side of things. When you're facing a certified payroll job, and you use paper, or you don't even use paper, you just pay people's salary, you have to figure out a way to track the time, right? So having a digital system that allows people to allocate their time in live form, it removes most of the headache when it comes to actually allocating the time. And then, right, so the other side of it is a lot of systems out there will do it by job. But you understand, like a project management platform will allocate the hours by job, by task, that type of stuff, but it misses the employee side of it altogether. And so then you run into that issue of how do I allocate the time for the employee, right? Because correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, on those reports, you have to show, because of the rates, the classification of the employee, like all the information they're getting paid. So what are some things that you can do to kind of help avoid that if you're not using a digital system like ClockShark yet?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just to confirm your premise there, the reports absolutely call for the breakout of data just like this, right? So if you have John Smith working 1 hour on Monday as a carpenter, but then also working 1 hour, even still on Monday, but as a plumber, that's going to be the breakout of data that's necessary on really any given certified report. And then it can get more complex even from there. But if you don't have some form of technology solution to manage that data that way right off the bat, really as the hours are being worked, the next best thing is you have to track that, in some format, whether it's a spreadsheet, whether it's on paper, because the reality of working in this space is that at the end of each pay period, you'll have to complete those certified reports in order to be compliant. And if you sit down and try to do one of those and realize you didn't have the data broken out properly from the get-go, it becomes a lot harder to fill out the report, which is a requirement no matter what. So that's kind of a roundabout way, Dwayne, of I think answering what you were.
Yeah, just shedding some detailed light on this topic in general. But a question that kind of comes up that relates to this is, what if there's an error or an issue?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So that's a very common thing, right? And sometimes it's not for the pay period that's unfolding. It could be for the previous pay period. It could be for a pay period 10 years ago or longer. I've seen that. And so if you do have an error that occurred for really any pay period, any element of data, the hours were reported on the wrong day, for example, or the rate wasn't correct, the best practice is that you're actually going to correct or amend this certified report that's related to that specific pay period, because there'll be an actual payroll number that corresponds with that report. That's what lets that agency know that you've gone back and amended that. And then there's typically, depending on the report format, a way to put commentary on there that says this is an amended report for this historical period that I'm resubmitting to correct the issue. So it comes down a lot to certain report formats, but that's kind of the theme as to the best practice for how to amend something that wasn't correct.
So what you're saying is never change the county that you work in.
That's an easy way of doing it.
Yeah, right. Don't go outside your zip code, right? And we all know that's not possible. But it comes down to just being organized and understanding what you're doing and when to do it, right? And here's an example of how you can display the data or the types of data that you can collect, right? To understand the job that you worked on, the individual task that they worked on as well, what day, and then the breakdown of the type of hours worked, right? So this is a very simple way to be able to collect all that time in a digital way. So you have everything laid out and it's ready to go. So you can really see and understand where all the hours are and when it was worked, right? So anything to add to this or anything to adjust or any questions that you see come up, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of funny. This, I'm sure people will recognize. This kind of looks almost like a certified report because the idea is exactly what Dwayne's describing: the management of the data at an employee level, and then the type of work that employee was doing, the job that they were doing it on, and then of course those daily hours. That's exactly what the reporting formats call for, is that breakout of data.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing that's really important is just having that sense of which jobs do we have where there's work occurring, what type of work are we performing on those jobs,
Mm-hmm.
and then of course getting those daily hours understood. You can put those pieces together from a technology standpoint, and you've got what you need to advance to the next part of the process, which is really going to be payroll focused. But
yeah, definitely. And a couple questions that come up. One, Janae, the penalties or fines. We'll get into that in a second. But then Nadine, thanks for the question. This report's a timesheet report out of ClockShark's time system. That's how we display the information per employee. And inside of a system like ClockShark, you have a plethora of different reports, right? So if you want to see the information per employee, this is what's going to show. You can pull the information per job, per customer breakdown too. So if you have multiple jobs on a customer, you're going to see all the information displayed right there. And the way we work with Points North, for example, is we send them a data dump, for lack of a better term, a giant CSV with all this information broken down. And with that, you can categorize the types of jobs that you want to pull a report on. If you only want to see the certified jobs and the hours they worked on it, you can easily display that on a report like this.
yeah, and only other comment I'll make on this is kind of exactly what everybody's describing, right? This concept of these different report formats and how they all work with this data. Say, for example, you have the solar job, which you can see there. Maybe that takes place in California. And that solar job is going to require a California specific certified report in order to be compliant.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe the next job down, that takes place over the border in Arizona. And that's going to need a very different certified report format in order to be compliant, but it's going to be the same data elements. So yeah, that's kind of exactly how you can think about this.
Yeah. And so that's one of the things we help people with is segmenting out the jobs so you can pull the information that you need for whatever type of report you run. That's the good thing about being organized, for lack of a better term. So the payroll process, right? So one of the things, so when Nick and I were putting this together, we're like, this is a great topic. This is amazing. This is a lot of help, but you literally can't do anything unless you have payroll. No joke. I mean, even I think, Nick, you said as long as you can apply you can just run payroll to apply the labor burden, the taxes and all that stuff, you're good, right? So in order to have payroll, in order to do everything, you have to allocate the taxes. You have to apply the employer burden, gross pay and deductions, all that information. Without it, it's not certified, right?
Yeah, the unique thing about this space is these reports call for not only payroll data, but the time data piece.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to have the time piece, of course, but then you also have to have that payroll component. Neither Dwayne nor myself currently offer a payroll solution. Right? So clients who want to use this overall process have to have some form of doing payroll so that those things happen. Right? Good example: gross pay and deductions. Virtually every certified report calls for the display of gross pay and deductions. So even if you have the time data understood, you know the projects, you know the work classes, you have to get that pay period actually completed from a true payroll standpoint, ensure that the employees were paid the proper prevailing wage rates. And now you'll have the full spectrum of data that's necessary to create a certified report and display all that information. So yeah, the payroll piece is a critical piece because without it, you won't have all the data that you need to finish the process.
Yeah, 100%. And all the companies out there, we don't really have any favorites or anything, but you may look into a couple companies that help out that process. We work with a couple payroll companies that really help lay out the fine details so it makes the certified payroll process a lot easier so you don't have to do multiple calculations. But the point we're trying to make is you can't do certified payroll unless you have payroll, right? It's just not possible. You have to be able to allocate the taxes, the employer burden, all that information in order to actually do it. And so here's what some of it looks like, right? So it's kind of a blown up version of the image that we had earlier, right? So it shows the gross pay, and then it shows all of the breakdown of all the deductions, right? And you only get that post payroll, regardless of the payroll system you use. But that's the glory of something like Points North, where they take the information from payroll and then break it all down, so that way you understand which jobs have which costs associated with it. Anything to add there, Nick?
Yeah, that's exactly the concept. And then because we'll also have the hours by day, by job, by work class, well, the rates that correspond to those hours that were worked. We've got the full spectrum of data to understand how to properly produce certified reports, how to properly help with the job costing aspect. That's where all the data ultimately ends up coming together on what we call a post payroll basis. And that's what you can see here too, is the combination of those hours, so that we understand the 7 hours for Monday for the road reconstruction project at a rate of $25.75. Now, this is pretty straightforward sample data. There's also things like the fringe rates, right? A lot of things that people are probably wondering about. All of that is stored and managed in a way that gives the system the full scope of data it needs to produce really any report that you might require in this space.
Agreed. I mean, I'm not a certified payroll expert by any means, or a payroll expert, or an expert, but just understanding this presentation, I've learned a couple of things from all the different companies that we've worked on together, Nick. But it can be overwhelming. My goodness. Like, if you've got 50 employees with 3 certified payroll jobs, if you don't already track this detail, and all of a sudden you need to, just to get reimbursed by the government, because that's the process, right? You basically work for free until you submit these reports and the government decides to pay you, right? And so poll question number 3: have you ever had an issue while paying prevailing wage? Simple yes or no answer. Have you ever had an issue while paying prevailing wage? Probably paying your employee prevailing wage. I'll split right down the middle. For those of you saying no, good for you. Unfortunately, that's not the majority of you. Have you ever had an issue while paying prevailing wage? Yes or no? A couple more seconds. All right. I think we're going to get all we can get out of that one. Looks like, unfortunately, the majority of you have had issues while paying prevailing wage. So right out of the gate, Nick, what are some issues that people come up with? Like, what do they encounter while trying to do this correctly?
Yeah, this is the interesting kind of point about this type of question, right? Where you may have 10,000 employees. You may have one certified job, right? And that certified job has its standard set of rates, and everything's good and fairly straightforward. And you still have the reporting component, right? You'll still have to produce that report, but the rates are fairly straightforward. Or you may have 20 employees, but by the nature of the business you do, you might have 50 prevailing wage jobs, and they might have all different rates that have to be applied all the time. And then you might have additional complexity with work classes, right? John Smith working as a carpenter and a plumber and an electrician, sometimes all on the same day. And so depending on what you have from a complexity standpoint with the rates, sometimes getting the rate piece taken care of is relatively straightforward. Sometimes it's the most complicated part of the process. And so that really depends on how many projects you're going to have, where those projects are occurring, and the type of work that's performing, which is obviously something that's different for everybody.
So that leads right into the most common section, right? Headaches that come in. The headaches that come in when you don't do it correctly, or you do it poorly, or you don't do it at all, right? So you have the payments that are held up, like I just mentioned. With government jobs, I mean, most jobs, even private ones, but these ones more than anything, you're working for free until you get the information in, until you get that check coming in from the government agency, basically reimbursing you for the wages that you paid your employees, right?
And this is one of the most common issues we'll see, right? Somebody will call, they'll say, I was working on a prevailing wage job. I didn't even know it was a prevailing wage job until recently. We've had a bunch of pay periods go by and nobody ever told us we even needed to do the reporting. And now they're saying we're not getting paid until we do it. And sometimes it's a big surprise. And it's really, a lot of times not even anybody's fault. just kind of the nature of this space, right? Sometimes it doesn't get made crystal clear right up front that a job is prevailing wage and it's going to have this reporting requirement. And so, long story short, no matter what the situation might be that causes the reporting to be late, the government's not shy about holding up your payments. That's basically what that boils down to. And I've seen a lot of different interesting examples. I've seen people with payments that have been held up for them over a year and a half because they're just behind on this reporting, or they did the reporting in the wrong format, right? Maybe they used a federal form instead of a state-specific form. And maybe they made errors on the actual report data, right? Not intentionally, but it was wrong. And so with that not being correct, the government can hold up the payments really for whatever reason they want to. An expired form, I mean, I could come up with a lot of examples for you. I'll try not to go too far with all the different things I've seen, but that's a big theme. A big common headache is payments being held up if you don't do the reporting on time in the right format.
Well, does the government agency like actually reach out to you and say, hey, this is wrong, do this? Or do you kind of have to know?
It's a good question, and the answer is it depends on who you're sometimes dealing with. Yep, I've seen some situations where the agency does not reach out. They expect you to figure it all out on your own, and as soon as you figure it out, great, send us the reports. But sometimes you'll get somebody who's at one of those agencies, they'll reach out and they'll say, hey, this was incorrect, or hey, you submitted a format of a report that was expired. And so you may get lucky and get everything laid out crystal clear for you from the agency. But that unfortunately is not really the norm. It'll be more that you're kind of in a on your own situation to figure it out, and the agency is going to just sit there and wait for what they expect from you, and you may not even fully know what they expect until you start dealing with what they're saying you haven't done, right? So it's kind of an interesting space. Yeah.
If it's anything like dealing with the DMV online,
exactly,
I don't want to do it. Yeah, that was fun. Other than payments held up, there's the historical revisions, there's the report format changes that we talked about in the past, right? Like keeping up on when they decide to change it. Let's say you guys have used the same report format for a specific county for the last 6 years, and all of a sudden they decide to update it, right? I'm assuming it's the depends answer, but do the government agencies typically let you know?
This is another great example. Typically, they don't. And it was actually October last year when the state of New Jersey, the state of Rhode Island, and then specifically the city of New York, they all basically threw out their report formats. I'm still not convinced they didn't coordinate on this somehow, but I have no proof. But they threw out their report formats and they created really brand new formats, radically different formats. And they gave everybody about a week to adjust to that. And so we had clients basically who had no idea the format had even changed, but with a system that really keeps all those formats up to date, it doesn't become an issue, right? You'll always be generating what's current and compliant. And that's an important thing in this space, because if those agencies decide for whatever reason they want to make a change, big or small, to the format, they can do it. And they can do it really with very little or no notice at all.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Seems unfair.
And then falsification, that's kind of an extreme one, but I do like to talk about it. There was an interesting case study that people might want to look up. It was called Honda Electric, and for years those folks were requiring their employees to give them kickbacks on the prevailing wages, and so they would actually get back money from the employee that they were owed, and then they would go falsify the certified reports, and they would put their signature to those and they'd submit them. And eventually there was a labor interview that happened. People, from the Department of Labor went on site and talked to these employees, and they got the real story. And ultimately the people who were falsifying those reports went to jail for actually upwards of 2 years. So these certified reports are not something that people take lightly. Falsifying them is kind of an extreme example of what you could think of as a headache. But if you do that, you certainly will have a headache. The government doesn't take it lightly. So.
Yeah, and that leads right into penalties. Right, that was a question that came up earlier. What are some penalties that come up if you do it wrong or late or anything?
Yeah, penalties is a good word to kind of talk about, because the most common thing you'll see is that people do it wrong, quote unquote, but not really intentionally, right? Maybe they're late in doing the report. Maybe they submitted in the wrong format. Maybe they left some required data off of the report. So the most common thing you'll see as far as what you can think of as a penalty is a withheld payment, right? And the government will say, we'll pay you, but only once this report's submitted and it's 100% correct. And so that's the most common thing. But if you do it wrong, as far as intentionally, right, there's pretty extreme penalties up to and including, like we talked about, imprisonment. But again, that's kind of an extreme example. The most common thing you'll see is there's going to be a delay in your payment if you don't do the reporting on time in the right format.
Did you say jail time?
It's happened.
Wow.
Only if you falsify it willingly, though.
How do you falsify it unwillingly? Just I don't understand. Unless you just literally don't know what you're doing, you just write scribble.
Which can happen too.
Yeah, I guess so. If someone just says, "Hey, go file this report," and you're just filling in random information, I feel like I do that when I transfer titles with DMV. It's just put in random information. But wrapping things up towards the end of this, we've already taken enough of your guys' times. I hope you guys have learned a lot of information, but we'll go over some quick tips and tricks for contractors or any of the subs that you guys are working with, right? So right out of the gate, you guys are going to want to adopt technology, right? A lot of the stuff that we just talked about is solved with technology. We're in the 21st century, and still doing things on paper and expecting no issues to come up is just the old school way of thinking. We know that's the way it's always been done, but technology is here to really help streamline the information and reduce all of those headaches and errors that we just talked about. Nick, what are some of the things that you see when people come to your technology? Like, what are some roadblocks or first things that people run into when they're trying to adopt that?
Sure. So one of the first things we'll always see is just an unfamiliarity with the data elements that have to be tracked, right?
Yeah.
Really understanding that hours by day, by job, by work class piece. And it's actually funny, there's a comment here about a headache. It says you're having an employee not clock in correctly, resulting in being paid regular versus prevailing wage is a headache. Yeah, absolutely. That really is something where if you don't have that system piece in place, right? Which, to your question, Dwayne, what do we see a lot? It's that there's a lack of these systems that are going to have to talk to each other, right? Because that exact example, somebody clocking in and getting the right rate associated, that doesn't guarantee they're going to get paid that rate, right? That's still got to get to payroll. And so that familiarity with the overall kind of data elements and the workflow, that's where we can really help shed some light on how that all ultimately interacts with each other, so that at the end of it, you've got a report that just reflects exactly what happened from a time and payroll perspective, and you're done.
Yeah, exactly. To add on that human error element, like programs like ClockShark, right? They were designed to help prevent those things, right? To get into the weeds a little bit, like you can have your specific jobs that are prevailing wage and have specific tasks assigned to that job. And then you assign that employee to that job. And so when they're on that job, they can only see those tasks and the jobs that they're assigned to, and the other employees won't even be able to see that. Right. And so if you get good at segmenting that information out, the data that comes in will always be correct. So there won't be any missed punches or, this department clocking time into this prevailing wage to try to sneak stuff in. Because that was something that happened to me 10, 12 years ago when I was a project manager, where I'd have time cards come in from people in the company on a prevailing wage job because it paid $40 an hour when they were never on the job site or never assigned to it. They're just trying to sneak in some extra money. And so having electronic systems in place that are built for that prevent that from happening. Just like kind of what I was saying, don't assume that you have all the right data on paper. Reviewing a stack of paper timesheets is only effective for like the first 3, right? And then once you get towards the bottom, it's just like, all right, whatever, sign. The assumptions is where a lot of those penalties, a lot of those issues come up, right? I mean, I couldn't imagine assuming that all the 30 different fields that have to be filled out on the WH347 are done correctly without some type of review or at least digital process in place.
Yeah, and the other thing to add to that, which is exactly kind of the theme of this part, getting that data onto the certified report, if you do that by hand or even by some form of quote unquote technology that really is still manual, right? Copy and pasting things without a direct feed of data from payroll, really ultimately to the report, there's definitely going to be a risk of something getting translated incorrectly, right? Whether it's just one little deduction value or whether it's somebody's entire paycheck being associated with the wrong employee. Without a direct leverage of the payroll data from a true technology standpoint directly to the reports, there's always risk of transposing data in one way or another.
Yes, that in accounting, right? In all of our college careers, we all thought we weren't ever going to have to use it. But when you're doing things like this, it makes a huge difference. Just the moving a decimal point and putting the wrong letter over here or just putting the wrong line on them, it changes everything dramatically. And so having technology in place really eliminates that. And again, I feel like, Nick, I feel like we're introducing a whole different set of things to be aware of, like problems or things to learn. That's why the bullet up there is just look for the help, right? That's why people like myself and Nick exist. That's why our companies exist, is to help you guys with those process. Let us teach you, let us show you how to do it, eliminate the headache, and really remove any of those potential penalties. And we'll help you be as detailed as possible. That's one of the things that we run into on the data collection side is we end up teaching people just how to be extremely specific and detailed on that, because in our experience, the more detailed you are on the data collection side, better off you are when it comes time to work with someone like Nick on the certified side. Anything to add to that?
That's exactly it. If you can put that degree of detail in from the start, which really starts with the time tracking, get that data to payroll properly with the rates, get the data from payroll to a system like ours where it goes to those very specific report formats, you've mitigated the risk all along the way. So that's exactly it.
All right. Let's see what's next. Q&A. Look at that. Question and answer. I feel like we've been doing this the whole time. Let's see. Are any of the questions out there that we haven't asked or kind of popping out at you? I feel like I had a whole bunch coming all at once.
Yeah, I did see a couple that I can jump into here. So there's one that says, is an employer required to give employee the rate being paid for prevailing wage jobs? And then kind of second part of that, are there pay stub requirements for prevailing wages paid? Is there a fringe benefit statement of any kind? And so the answer really to all that is yes, right? So if I'm interpreting that question correctly, if the prevailing wage is defined for a project and for a work classification, the employee that's going to work on that project and has that work classification does have to receive that prevailing wage rate in total, right? So if the prevailing wage is $60 an hour, that could be made up of, just the hourly rate, and then what's also called fringe. And you're alluding to that in your question too. And so the short answer is, yeah, the employee has to receive that. And then there has to be very specific reporting up to and including fringe benefit statements that really tell the government this employee received the entirety of what they were owed as a condition of being on this job. And that's ultimately what the prevailing wage really is. And that's ultimately what the reporting is really all about, is kind of proving, so to speak, that that employee got the full value of what they were entitled to based on the fact that it was a government job.
No, great answer. Great question. One of them that's been kind of lingering there for a minute there. It's like, where do you find the prevailing wages for your area? Like, where does that data exist?
Yeah, it's another great question. And so the answer is that depending on where you are in the country, there'll be different ways of receiving that definitive data, right? And so one of the best practices for that is if you have a government funded job, a prevailing wage job, you should be given some form of contract for that job. And within that, and there's different terminologies that are used all over the country for this, but the theme is you get that contract, and within that, there should be what's called a wage determination. And it should reference very, very clearly and specifically for that job what the appropriate prevailing wages are. And then, I'll give you another example. I'm sure we have a lot of people from California on with us here. The California DIR, Department of Industrial Relations, well, they've moved a little bit more into the 21st century. And they've started putting some of this stuff online, and you can start accessing it depending again on which agencies you're working with from those agency websites, and they'll make sure it's available that way. And so it's a different answer depending on where you are in the country, but you should always be able to go back and reference the actual wage determination that was part of the specific contract or packet that you received when you take on the job.
There's another one in there. Some of these are specific to ClockShark. So I appreciate that, and I'll go into that in just a second, but I want to make sure we're on this topic. Is there a way to assign the different rates to each employee currently working on a prevailing wage rate job, and it'd be helpful to transfer that information? So I want to say yes. I mean, every employee technically has their different rates, but I'm wondering if there's a different way or a different thing that they may be thinking of with that question, Nick.
Yeah, I think if I interpret that one correctly, the question is, you've got John Smith, and John Smith as an employee should receive certain rates at certain times, right? Just to kind of keep it high level. And so the answer to that is absolutely yes. As far as our system, we have what we call rate management, where if we're bringing in data from ClockShark, or I should say a client is going to bring in data from ClockShark. The data from ClockShark coming into us can interact with this rate data that would be set up in our system at either just a project level or a work class level or an employee level, or even a combination of those levels. And so certain employees can be associated to those certain rates, and then we can help get that data to payroll, where ultimately the payroll process is going to take place. And then sometimes, what I'm assuming is being referenced here is there might be like a GL file that has to go to QuickBooks. And at that point, the payroll system understands the right data to get to the GL platform. And so it's kind of a long answer, and I don't mean to get too into the weeds on that one, but the shorter answer is yes, there is definitely a way to do that, because that's a common thing that's a requirement depending on how you're paying your employees.
Yeah, the visibility side, especially if you're in California, that stuff's got to be on the pay stuff. So to answer a couple questions for the ClockShark related ones. So to set up prevailing wage specific jobs in ClockShark, you create a set of jobs and then you assign people to those jobs. And so in ClockShark, it's more of the employee management side that you can assign them to specific jobs and you just label them, right? So there's a few different areas that you can label jobs, and most people just put PW in front of them. So that way you know exactly which ones are prevailing wage, which ones are government jobs, however you want to classify it. And you can run a report specifically to a single report or a group of reports that are specific to prevailing wage. And again, you assign the employees to those specific jobs, so that way they can only see those when they're clocking in and out on the mobile app. So that's a nice thing with ClockShark, is you can organize them to limit certain access to certain things, whether that's the entire job, or just the individual task that they're working, right? So if you've got a certain classification of people that, they're only framers at this job, but over here they're going to be electricians, you can designate that in ClockShark, so that way this task is assigned to this job. So when they're on that job, they only see that task. So there's a specific way you can do that inside of ClockShark, but that's what it was built for, so that you can split out that time and make sure that there's no errors or confusion for the guys out in the field, right? Because there's a lot of apps out there that just show them a whole bunch of jobs they have to sift through, and then a whole bunch of tasks you have to sift through. With ClockShark, we give you guys the ability to really segment that out and get detailed on and how to configure what they can and can't see to eliminate that whole process. Because the worst thing to do is, let's say you have to pay these on prevailing wage jobs, right? You pay them weekly, or you submit the reports for weekly pay periods. It's having to go back through all that information 2 months later and correct everything. With ClockShark, when done properly, you set it up beforehand, and then all the information is information and data is collected correctly on the front end. So that way it makes everything that much more smooth. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer for like 3 or 4 questions that were all around the same thing.
And there's one more here that I'll address, because I'm sure several people might be wondering, is what type of things count as quote unquote fringe, right? And that really is a great question.
Yeah.
In this overall context, because when you're dealing with the prevailing wage, right, it's a specific amount that the employee has to receive as far as the value for their work on a job. And that is oftentimes made up of, or could be made up of, what's called fringe, which is basically additional benefits that are being paid to an employee. And so the answer is, again, one of those things that's going to be a little bit different depending on where you're doing your work in the country. But there are what are called qualified or bona fide benefits that are able to be considered fringes for prevailing wage purposes. So things like contributions to training funds, things like health and welfare contributions, pension contributions. Oftentimes those will be things that are considered qualified, or bona fide is the term in this space, fringes. And so the best way to get a definitive answer on that is talking to the agency responsible for the contract and saying, here's what I'm paying. Are these bona fide qualified fringes for the purposes of prevailing wage? But those are just some quick examples for you of the type of things that typically will qualify.
Definitely. Fringe has always confused me, because I feel like I can be anything.
And then of course it has to be on the reports.
Yeah, it has to be there. It's only fringe if it's reportable. And some of these questions, unfortunately, are payroll specific, and neither ClockShark or Points nor the payroll company, so we don't want to speak on behalf of that, as that is highly specific to where you are in the country. So if you have additional payroll questions, you can submit them. They'll show up in the webinar review for us, and we'll have a payroll professional reach out to you. All right. Any other questions before we jump off here? We got about 2 minutes before we jump out of here. Okay. So on the screen, you got some contact information, right? ClockShark. We're all over the place. You ClockShark.com, Facebook, LinkedIn, the whole Instagram, all of that stuff. Emails, hello@ClockShark. One of the things that is the easiest way to get a hold of us is go to our website and go to the chat bot. Bottom left-hand side of the screen, there's going to be a little bubble that pops up. You can get a live person within a minute or two. They're all extremely talented, very knowledgeable, to the level that they're all QuickBooks Pro advisors, for example. So they know how to set up your guys' account, really know how to get into the details and understand the inner workings of your business from our perspective. And then, of course, we have point source information, certifiedpayrollreporting.com. Great snag on the web URL there, guys. And then they have the Points North for Facebook. They have, sales at pointsnorth.com, LinkedIn. They're all over the place as well. Please reach out with additional questions. And if you guys have anything else, please let us know. You can always email us, either ClockShark or Points North. So I thank you for everyone joining us today. Again, if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you all for joining us this lovely afternoon. Thanks, Nick. Appreciate
Thank you,
the time,
everybody.
man.
Yeah, appreciate it.